Well, we're going to talk about this a little more now with John Lough, who is head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. He's on the line from London, an expert on Russia and Eastern Europe. Thank you so much for joining us. We do appreciate your time. I don't know if you listened there to our correspondent in Kyiv, Gulliver Cragg. I would like to talk about that after a few initial questions, this idea of will Russia just, is it all about calling Russia's bluff? Do they not intend to sign anything? First of all, perhaps we could talk about some of the individual parts of this plan. There is this report that the European Union and Ukraine have managed to water it down somewhat. It seems that what is most unacceptable to Ukraine at the moment is the idea of losing territory. Is that the case, do you think? Is that the worst bit of it for Ukraine? Permanently
I think
losing territory?
I think there are three problematic areas here for Ukraine. First is this notion that they should be giving up territory that they already control. Secondly, there's the question of a restriction on the size of the Ukrainian army. And this relates then to Ukraine's ability to defend itself in future, because the Ukrainians justifiably fear that the Russians may come again. And this leads to the third point, where there's absolutely no clarity, which is what sort of security guarantees might Ukraine reasonably receive. My assumption is that it actually will receive almost no meaningful security guarantees from its Western allies, because nobody wants to get into a war with Russia. So the only solution then is to build up the Ukrainian army into something that could in fact deter Russia in future. And that's where you don't want to have restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian army. So I think we're going to go round and round this issue, and I suspect that it's going to take some time to sort it out. So the notion that the Ukrainians are going to be forced to sign up to something very quickly, I think is actually not realistic. President Trump seems to step back a little bit from that. But it does seem that Marco Rubio made some progress in these talks, he and the American delegation in Geneva. And let's see what the next draft of this text, and I think it's a little bit maybe ambitious to call it a peace plan. It's a set of provisions that might ultimately go into some sort of peace agreement.
You mentioned two things there. One, the idea of the capping of Ukraine's army. There are reports that, whereas in the first draft it's 800,000 during peacetime, that would, or 600,000 during peacetime, that could be improved from the Ukrainian point of view to 800,000. Also, this idea of the peace, the security guarantee that you were saying was so vague. Give us your thoughts on this idea that instead of it being in the constitution of NATO that Ukraine could never join, and in Ukraine's constitution that it would never ask to join, there might be something much vaguer on that, and possibly a security guarantee that if Ukraine is attacked, that is seen as an attack on the US, and although it would not be a member of NATO, the US would undertake to help Ukraine. An attack on Ukraine would be an attack on the US. I'm guessing you think that amounts to very little.
Well, if the if the US were to make that commitment, it would be extremely meaningful for Ukraine. But there's been no indication so far that the United States is ready to do that. It sees the problem with Ukraine and Ukraine's security as something fundamentally European that the Europeans need to take care of. And the problem is the Europeans won't do it without some sort of US backstop. So I don't see that this really can be resolved easily at all. So my conclusion is that you then build up the Ukrainian army to make it something formidable, and you deploy trainers, all the equipment the Ukrainians need to turn their army into something that can genuinely deter the Russians in future. And then the Ukrainians probably have to rely on their relations with their closest neighbors, in particular with Poland, perhaps also with UK, France, Germany, also somehow to flesh out their defences. But I don't think there's going to be any willingness on the part of this administration in the US to underwrite Ukraine's security. I think that's simply off the table, and the Russians know it.
You were saying there that Europe is not going to, when push comes to shove, really be much use to Ukraine. Earlier, we heard the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, speaking today. He said Ukraine's interests align with the European Union's interests in this matter. I think we can just take a listen to that.
Ukraine's interests are also Europe's common interests, and we want to safeguard them together in the long term. This means that Ukraine must not be forced to make unilateral territorial concessions. Ukraine must continue to be able to defend itself effectively against aggression in the future, and to do so, it needs strong armed forces and reliable security guarantees from its partners.
Yeah, he's clearly suggesting, as you do, that it comes down to Ukraine having a very, very significant force itself, or at least a minimally significant force. The idea that the European Union, with Ukraine, with the US, with Russia, would have a joint enforcing body for any peace deal or any road to the end of the war. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to imagine that you're going to have something like the Gaza model with President Trump, chairing a peace committee. The Russians won't allow that to happen. So it's not clear how any sort of peace agreement, in fact, would be implemented, whether it would be done perhaps under the auspices of the United Nations. There are certainly some sort of peace monitoring force is going to be needed, because there has to be an area that is demilitarized around the front line, wherever that may in future lie. And then you've got to think about where are those peace observers, or maybe even peacekeepers, where are they actually going to be drawn from, which countries? Could China play a role here? Could India play a role? Pakistan or another country? Again, absolutely no clarity on this. But I think the key question now is whether it's going to prove possible to freeze this conflict for a while I think these broader, more complicated questions are actually addressed. And that concerns also the military posture of Russia in future in Europe, because there's this idea on the part of the Russians that they need to restrict Ukraine's armed forces in terms of their size and capabilities, but there's nothing in this draft document about what obligations might rest on Russia. So there is so much still here to be negotiated, and I don't think we're anywhere near a final outcome at present.
We do sometimes see surprising results from the Donald Trump style of diplomacy. It's true that in Gaza, the bombs, for the most part, have stopped thanks to that deal. Is this Russia-Ukraine thing very different, largely because neither side seems yet ready to stop this war?
Well, I think the big difference here is that the United States has leverage over Israel in a way that it doesn't over Russia. More than that, President Trump still seems sympathetic to Russia's version of events when it comes to the reason for this war in Ukraine. Obviously, the part of the electorate in the United States favors the United States disengaging from support for a war of this kind. In some ways, that's absolutely understandable. But it's a question of how the US disengages and how its authority might suffer in the process, and indeed how NATO as an alliance, its credibility might suffer. So what I detect is in the administration itself, there are, I think, different views, different understandings of how this war should be brought to an end. Obviously, there's consensus that it needs to be ended. But for example, the position of the Vice President J.D. Vance, it seems to me, is very different from that of the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio. So within the administration, I think there's an argument raging about what, in fact, can reasonably be expected of Ukraine without forcing the country to capitulate, and equally, how pressure, in fact, can be put on Russia to force Russia to make concessions. Marco Rubio has said several times throughout his time in office that there has to be compromise on both sides in order to reach a sustainable and indeed durable agreement.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much, John Lough from the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. Thank you so much for your time. We really do appreciate your thoughts and insights on all of that.